A field in Holland, August 1929. A large canvas tent has been raised on the grounds of a castle called Eerde, near the small Dutch town of Ommen, where the river Vecht makes a slow curve through flat green farmland and the August sky presses down warm and pale. Inside the tent, 3,000 people sit in rows on wooden chairs and folded blankets. They have come from across Europe, from India, from the Americas and Australia. Some travelled for weeks, some gave up jobs. Some gave up more than jobs. They gave up the scaffolding of whatever life they had been living before the promise of this gathering made that life feel insufficient. They are waiting for a young man named Jiddu Krishnamurti. He is 34 years old. He has dark, large, luminous eyes and a slim build, and a quality of stillness that people who met him consistently struggled to describe accurately. The organization called the Order of the Star in the East has been preparing the world for his arrival since 1909. 45,000 members in 30 countries have organized their inner lives, at least in part, around the belief that this particular man is the vehicle through which the next great spiritual teaching would come to a suffering world. The tent is quiet, in the particular way of large gatherings before they begin. 3,000 people breathing together, almost carefully, as though a sudden sound might disturb something that has taken decades to arrange. Somewhere beyond the canvas walls, the river Vecht moves over its shallow bed without any awareness of the occasion. Krishnamurti walks to the front. The way he moves is unhurried in a way that is not a performance. He simply does not carry in his body the accumulation of self-consciousness that most people bring to important moments. He stands at the front of the tent and looks out at 3,000 faces, and he opens his mouth. What he says is not what anyone expects. He says that truth is a pathless land. He says that no organization can lead a human being to it. No priest, no ritual, no system, no hierarchy, no belief, and no teacher, including Krishnamurti himself, has ever genuinely delivered a person to what is real. He says he wants to free people from the cage of dependence, and that this includes the cage of following him. He says he cannot in good conscience continue to allow himself to be used as the vehicle for something that, by its very nature as an organized movement, defeats its own purpose. Then he dissolves the Order of the Star. He returns the castle. He returns the money. He returns the title. 3,000 people sit in the August warmth and do not quite know what to do with what they have just heard. The river Vecht makes its curve and continues. This is where tonight begins. With that gesture, with a man standing in front of everything that had been built around him and saying, "I am putting this down, not because it is bad, not because the people who built it had bad intentions, but because he had looked very carefully at what it was, and what he saw did not match what it was supposed to be." Let your own body settle now. Notice wherever it rests, the surface beneath you, the weight distributed through the shoulders and the back and the length of the legs. The day is finished. The requirements of the day are finished. Tonight we will move slowly through all of what Krishnamurti spent 60 years teaching after that August morning. The mind that watches itself, the thought that mistakes itself for a person, the quiet that is not an achievement to be reached, but something already present beneath the noise of all this reaching. There is no arrival required tonight. There is only the listening and the slow, reliable arrival of sleep. Chapter 2. The World That Chose Him. He was born on the 11th of May, 1895, in Madanapalli, a small town in the Madras Presidency in South India. He was the 8th of 11 children in a Telugu-speaking Brahmin family. His father was a revenue official in the British colonial administration, a steady, careful man of modest income and conventional religious observance. The family home had a courtyard with a well, a mango tree in the corner, and the kind of dry afternoon light that particular region of India carries in the hot season, flat and clear and uncompromising. The kind of light that shows things as they are. His mother, Sanjayvama, was by several accounts an unusually gentle woman. She died of fever when Krishnamurti was 10 years old. The death left something in the household that did not fill back in. His older brother Nitya, who would later share his life until dying of tuberculosis at 27, said that their mother's death was the fact around which everything else in their childhood was quietly arranged. Krishnamurti himself rarely spoke about her directly, but people who knew him as an adult often noted a particular quality in the way he listened, patient, unhurrying, present to the person in front of him in a way that did not demand anything in return. Some attributed it to temperament, others thought it was learned through loss very early. His father, Jiddu Narayanaya, moved the family to Adyar, near Madras, in 1909, having secured a position with the Theosophical Society, whose international headquarters occupied a long, beautiful stretch of land beside the Bay of Bengal. The Theosophical Society was a late Victorian spiritual organization founded in New York in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, and committed to the proposition that beneath all the world's religious traditions ran a single perennial wisdom, and that this wisdom was accessible through direct investigation rather than through the intermediary of any particular church or priest. By 1909, Annie Besant, the remarkable English social reformer who had become the Society's president, was convinced that the time was approaching for a great teacher to appear. She and a senior member named Charles Leadbeater had been watching for signs. In April of 1909, Leadbeater noticed a boy on the beach at Adyar, a slight, barefoot, 14-year-old with very large dark eyes and an unusual quality of inwardness, an absence of the self-assertiveness that most children carry. Leadbeater wrote to Besant that he had found what they were looking for. What followed was immediate and total. The boy was removed from his father's household and placed under the Society's care. He was bathed, clothed differently, given tutors in English and French and later German. He was sent to England for formal education, to a series of careful houses and schools in the Surrey countryside, and later in Oxford and London. He was introduced to important people in drawing rooms, at garden parties, at the tables of the kind of English upper-middle-class spiritualists who were then numerous. He gave speeches. He sat for photographs. He travelled first class on ships between continents. He was, through all of this, extraordinarily cooperative. Not passive, he had opinions, and those who knew him well said he could be stubborn on certain matters. But cooperative in the deeper sense. He did not fight the role. He did not perform resentment or ambivalence. He wore the role as one wears a coat, fully aware that it was a coat. Something in him had already begun a long, private, continuous project that was completely separate from the public role. He was watching, not watching the people around him, though he was perceptive about them, watching the watching itself, watching what the mind does when it watches, watching where the watching comes from, and whether the one who watches is as real and as fixed as it believes itself to be. Feel the weight of your body now, the way it settles into where it rests, the muscles you have been contracting without noticing for hours, they can release. Nothing about who you are is required to perform tonight. The watching can happen without any effort. It is already happening. It was happening before you began to listen to this voice. Chapter 3, Ommen, August 1929. Back to the tent. To the wooden chairs and the August heat and the 3,000 people who had organized the texture of their inner lives around a promise. And the moment that promise was returned to them unused, to understand the courage of what Krishnamurti did that morning, you need to understand the scale of what he was declining. The Order of the Star in the East was not a small cult or a marginal movement. It had 45,000 dues-paying members across 30 countries. There were estates in multiple countries, the Castle Eerd in the Netherlands, a property at Ojai in California, a large home in Taormina in Sicily. There was a publication called The Star Review. There were annual gatherings at Ommen that had been growing in size for years. The society had purchased a ship, the Star of India, specifically to transport the world teacher as his public work expanded. And behind all of this was Annie Besant herself, then 82 years old, one of the most formidable public figures of the late Victorian era, a woman who had championed workers' rights, Indian independence, women's education, and esoteric spirituality with equal intensity and equal effectiveness. She believed completely in what she had built. She believed Krishnamurti was exactly what she had told the world he was. He knew this. He had known her since he was 14. He had sat with her in the evenings in her house at Adyar and listened to her talk about the coming age, the great work, the purpose toward which his life was oriented. He had not argued. He had listened and watched and continued his private project of looking at what the mind actually is when you look at it carefully. By his late 20s, something had become undeniable to him. The structure of organized spirituality, the teacher who knows more than the student, the initiate who has access to something the ordinary person lacks, the path that runs from ignorance through practice to enlightenment. This structure, whatever the intentions behind it, produced in people not freedom but dependency. It produced people who looked outward for authority rather than inward for understanding. And looking outward for authority was precisely, he had concluded, the movement that prevented the inner life from being free. The cage was not bad intentions. The cage was structure itself. On the 3rd of August 1929, he stood up in front of 3,000 people who needed him to be what they had been told he was, and said that he could not be it. He said that truth is a pathless land, and that he was disbanding the organization that had been built to deliver people to it because the existence of the organization contradicted the truth it claimed to serve. He was 34. He had nothing waiting for him on the other side of this act. No plan, no organization of his own, no income from the dissolved movement. What he had was the clarity of having seen something and the willingness to act on it, even though the action cost him everything he had been given. The American psychologist William James, in his private diary entry from the 30th of April 1870, wrote that his first act of free will would be to believe in free will, that he would choose, in the face of his own depression and philosophical despair, to act as though choice were real. He was 28. He had nothing certain to stand on. He acted anyway and built one of the great intellectual careers of the 19th century on the shaky platform of that single chosen belief. Krishnamurti's act is of a different kind, but in the same neighborhood. The act of someone who has looked at what they have been given and decided to refuse it on the grounds that honesty is more important than safety. There is a long pause available in that gesture. Not a dramatic pause, a quiet one, the kind of pause that follows when something large has been put down. The room after that kind of putting down has a particular quality, less dense somehow, more breathable. Notice the breath, not changing it, not directing it anywhere, just noticing that it is moving, that it was moving before you paid attention to it, and it will continue when your attention drifts elsewhere, which it will and which is fine. Chapter 4, Truth is a Pathless Land. The 5 words stay. Truth is a pathless land. This phrase is one of the few things Krishnamurti said publicly that can be quoted with complete certainty. His own words from his own mouth at Ommen in 1929. His books and transcribed talks are held carefully by the Krishnamurti Foundation, which maintains them with a protective seriousness that reflects just how easy it is to misquote him and how frequently it happens. The vast majority of what he taught requires paraphrase rather than quotation, but these 5 words are his, clearly, from that morning. A pathless land, not a pathless void, not empty, not absent, not non-existent. A land, something real, something that has ground under it, that a person can actually inhabit, but without a path to it, without a map, without a guide who has been there before and can show the way, or a system that was developed by someone who arrived there and who now teaches the route. This disturbed people in 1929, and it disturbs people still. We are organized as a civilization around the assumption that important destinations require routes. You want to become a surgeon, there is a path, It runs through medical school and residency and boards and years of supervised practice. You want to learn a language? There is a path. It runs through vocabulary and grammar and listening and imitation and slow expansion. The path is how you get from not knowing to knowing. It seems obvious. It seems like the only way things work. Krishnamurti spent 60 years questioning whether this is true for the inner life. Not because effort is bad, not because practice is useless or discipline is worthless, but because he had noticed something in himself and then, over decades, recognized it in the faces and reports of the people he spoke with. The effort to reach a particular inner state almost always produces the effort, not the state. The mind turns its full attention to becoming calm, and what it gets is the full attention of a mind trying to become calm, which is not the same as calm. The mind practices awareness, and what it achieves is a very practiced awareness that is aware of itself being practiced, not the quiet, open, unselected attention of genuine awareness. The mind works very hard to be present, and it gets the exhausting experience of a mind working very hard, which is as far from presence as a person can get. The goal is always slightly ahead of the reaching, because the reaching is what makes the goal appear to be elsewhere. This is not a new observation. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the early 19th century, noted that the will, the driving, striving force in human consciousness, is almost constitutionally incapable of resting. It achieves one thing and immediately reconstitutes itself around the next, so that the experience of life for the unexamined will is a continuous sequence of incompleteness. Schopenhauer proposed art and aesthetic contemplation as temporary relief. Krishnamurti was proposing something more direct. What he pointed toward was a quality of attention that is not manufactured by technique, not the product of practice or discipline or concentrated effort, but something already operating quietly beneath the layer of evaluation and commentary and judgment that the conditioned mind runs continuously. A seeing that does not require anything to have happened first. He called it choiceless awareness. The choice is removed, the selecting, approving, disapproving, the endless evaluation the mind applies to everything it encounters, including itself. What remains when the choosing stops is not blankness, it is not emptiness. It is a clear seeing of what is actually there, without the distortion that judgment applies. You may have touched this briefly, without naming it. In those few seconds after waking, before you knew what day it was or what was expected of you, when there was just the light on the ceiling and the body's weight and the breath and the particular quality of the room, simple and complete. In a moment of very great fatigue, when the machinery of the self-improving mind ran out of fuel and went quiet, not because you made it quiet, but because you stopped. That quality, that is what he was pointing at. He spent 60 years pointing at it, because the pointing never quite becomes the thing, but the direction the pointing indicates is available to anyone who looks honestly. The direction is available right now. Chapter 5. The Life He Put Down. After Ommen, Krishnamurti did something unusual. He kept talking. Not under the aegis of the order or the society or any other organization, not with a staff or a hierarchy or a formal structure of any kind. He simply continued, for the next 57 years, to give talks in small rooms and large auditoriums in the hill town of Ojai in California, where he spent part of each year, in Brockwood Park in Hampshire, where he eventually established a school, in Madras and Bombay and Varanasi, in Geneva and Paris and New York, in Sarnen in Switzerland, where the summer gatherings under a large tent in a meadow became among the most attended events of their kind in the 20th century. He charged no admission. He asked for no commitment. He founded no religion, endorsed no practice, prescribed no belief system, refused every request to declare himself enlightened or to confirm or deny any spiritual status. When people asked him to summarize what he was teaching, he resisted the summary. When people tried to build a movement around him after 1929, he dissolved it. When students tried to become devoted followers, he pushed gently against the devotion. When admirers tried to turn his words into a new scripture, he pointed out that scripture is exactly the problem. He talked about thought. He talked about time. He talked about fear and the relationship between fear and thought. He talked about the self, what it is, where it comes from, whether what we call the self is a fixed thing or a continuous construction that is made and remade each moment by the memories and comparisons and desires that pass through. He talked about the observer and the observed, and about the strange moment when you see that the one watching and the thing being watched are not two separate things, but one movement. He answered questions from audiences for hours at a time. The questions were often the same questions. People returned year after year, asking variations of the same thing, because the thing they were trying to understand was not answerable through an explanation, but through a quality of looking that takes time to develop. He answered without impatience. Not because he was performing patience, but because something in the nature of his attention was genuinely undisturbed by repetition. He was also, by most accounts, an extraordinary human being in ordinary ways. He gardened, he cooked occasionally, and well. He was fastidious about his clothing in a way that seemed to coexist comfortably with his complete absence of self-importance. He walked every day when he could in the hills above Ojai or through the English countryside around Brockwood, and people who walked with him said he noticed things, a particular bird, a shadow on a stone, the way light moved through a specific tree with a freshness that was not performed. He simply looked at things, and they looked new to him, not because he was pretending they were new, but because each moment of looking was genuinely fresh. He died on the 17th of February, 1986, at Ojai, California. He was 90 years old. His last public talk was given 3 weeks before his death. He was too ill to stand at the end. The people who were with him said that even then, even in a body failing from liver disease, the quality of his presence, the particular kind of attention he brought to whoever was in the room, was unchanged. What he left behind was not a system, it was a way of looking. An encouragement, patient, persistent, rigorous, and remarkably free of condescension, to look at the mind from the inside, with the same precision that the mind usually reserves for the outside world. The body that lies in the dark tonight has been used all day. The eyes focused and refocused. The muscles contracted and released, many times against many kinds of effort. The brain processed more information than any previous generation would have recognized as a single day's work. Let it rest. The looking that Krishnamurti spoke about is not an effort. It is what happens when effort briefly releases its grip. Chapter 6. Two kinds of tired. There are two kinds of tiredness, and tonight you may be carrying the second. The first kind belongs to the body. The muscles have worked, the legs have carried you, the hands have typed, or lifted, or gestured, or held. The eyes have focused and refocused all day long, adjusting distances, processing light, tracking the movement of screens and faces, and the ordinary visual field of a lived day. This tiredness has a simple resolution. The body lies down. The body asks only to be horizontal and warm and not required to do anything further. Given those conditions, the body heals with a reliability that is almost matter of fact. The second kind does not belong to the body. It belongs to the mind, and it does not respond to lying down. It is the tiredness that continues after the eyes close. The mind that is still moving, still calculating, still composing responses to conversations that ended hours ago. Still located somewhere in tomorrow, and what needs to be done before tomorrow feels manageable. Still reviewing the events of the day with a persistence that seems, at this hour, both urgent and slightly absurd. This is the tiredness Krishnamurti spent his life investigating. Not with the intention of offering a cure, he was suspicious of cures, of techniques, of anything that proposed to deliver the mind to a better state through the application of a method. But with a genuine curiosity about the mechanism, what is this exactly? This mind that cannot stop? What is it doing when it reviews and calculates and worries and plans? What does it actually want? And is what it wants the same as what it says it wants? The mind says it wants rest. It says it wants to stop, but it continues. This small discrepancy between what the mind says it wants and what it actually does is one of the places Krishnamurti looked most carefully, and what he found there was not a flaw in the machinery, but a clue about what the machinery is. We will come back to this. There are two kinds of tiredness, and by the time this night is finished, you will have a different relationship with the second kind. Not because you will have learned a technique for stopping it. Krishnamurti was clear, again and again across 60 years, that techniques for stopping the mind are themselves activities of the mind and do not produce what they promise. But because you will have seen what the second tiredness is made of, and seen it clearly, and the seeing itself changes the thing seen. That is the promise for tonight. Not a technique, a quality of looking. In his book Freedom from the Known, published in 1969, Krishnamurti wrote, in effect, that the ability to remain with a question without urgently needing to answer it is itself a kind of intelligence. The conditioned mind cannot do this. The conditioned mind moves immediately from question to answer, from uncertainty to the nearest available certainty, because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and the mind has been trained to reduce discomfort through acquisition, through getting the answer, the explanation, the resolution. But the rush to answer is often what prevents the question from opening fully. And it is in the full opening of the right question that something changes, not in the answer. The question tonight is simple. What is the second kind of tiredness made of? Where does it come from? Is it you, this tiredness, this calculating, reviewing, anticipating activity? Or is it something the mind is doing which is not the same as being what you are? Sit with that, not urgently, lightly. The question has been waiting in the dark for as long as people have lain awake at night, wondering why they cannot stop thinking. Krishnamurti gave 60 years to it. Tonight, we take a few hours. Let your shoulders drop. Let the jaw soften. Notice the silence behind the sounds of the room, the ordinary quiet that is always there, underneath whatever noise the world makes. The second kind of tiredness runs on something. Tonight, we will see what Chapter 7, The Rooms We Build in Time. Thought operates almost entirely in time. Not in the cosmic sense, not the age of the universe or the slow dying of stars, but in the intimate kind, yesterday and tomorrow. The memory of what happened and the anticipation of what might. This is the territory where the calculating mind spends most of its working life, and Krishnamurti returned to it again and again across 4 decades of public talks, approaching it from different angles, in different languages and different rooms, but always arriving at the same place. The mind builds rooms from time. It takes the bricks of memory, accumulated since childhood, some of them very old, some of them laid down so long ago that the original event is no longer accessible, but the brick remains, solid and load-bearing, and it uses these bricks to construct an interior space that it then calls itself. This is who I am. This is what has happened to me. This is what I have learned, and what I fear, and what I want. The room feels very solid. It feels like the most real thing there is, because it is the ground on which everything else stands. But a room built from memory is not a fixed thing. It is something continuously reconstructed. Every morning, the mind reassembles the room from the materials it has been carrying, makes the walls plausible, puts the familiar furniture in the familiar places. The reconstruction is so rapid and so practiced that it feels like continuity. It feels like the same person waking up who went to sleep, and in the ordinary sense, it is. But the sense in which it is not the same person is interesting and worth sitting with. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was born into slavery in the 1st century CE in Hierapolis in what is now Turkey, taught his students something adjacent. He divided the world into 2 categories: things that are in our power, our judgments, our desires, our impulses, our responses, and things that are not in our power, the body, reputation, circumstance, what other people do. The first category is freedom. The second is weather. He was not, in the discourses he gave in his school in Nicopolis, recommending indifference. He was recommending precision, Know exactly which room you are actually in and stop furnishing the other room as though you lived there. Krishnamurti would not have put it quite this way. He was suspicious of frameworks that divide reality into neat categories, because the mind reaches for the category and then believes the reaching has done the understanding. But the underlying observation is the same. We spend most of our interior lives in rooms that are constructed from something other than what is actually present. Yesterday, mostly, or tomorrow. Tonight, the room is a bedroom. The ceiling is actual. The darkness pressing at the windows is actual. The body lying in the bed is warm and present and neither yesterday nor tomorrow. The constructed room, the one built from memory and projection, is also real in its own way. It will be there in the morning, reliably assembled, ready for another day of use. But it does not need to be furnished tonight. The furniture can wait. Here is a quieter detail. The person who built the room is also made of the same material as the room. The builder and the built are both constructions, from memory, from language, from the accumulated weight of being a particular person who has had particular experiences in a particular culture at a particular time. This is not a reason for despair. It is simply interesting. And interesting things, seen clearly, tend to be less frightening than they were before being seen. Chapter 8. What is thought? Krishnamurti asked this question so many times, in so many rooms, in so many countries, that it became something like a signature move. Not as a rhetorical question, not as a device to lead an audience toward an answer he had already prepared, an actual investigation, a genuine wanting to know what is thought exactly when you look at it directly. Here is what he kept finding, or at least what he kept saying he found. Thought is a response from memory. Every thought that arises, every image, word, comparison, judgment, plan, fantasy, worry, is a retrieval operation. The mind reaches into the accumulated archive of what it has experienced, learned, been taught, absorbed from the culture it grew up inside, and produces, out of that archive, a response to whatever is in front of it. There is no thought that comes from nowhere. Every thought is a movement from the known. This is the extraordinary machinery that allows a person to speak a language, navigate a city, maintain relationships, practice a profession, operate in the practical world with the enormous competence that most adults routinely demonstrate. The machinery is genuinely remarkable. Krishnamurti never said otherwise. But then he made the step that stopped people. He said, "The same process that produces the thought, 'I need to buy milk,' also produces the thought, 'I am an anxious person.' The same retrieval operation that remembers how to drive a car also retrieves the image of the scent. Yourself as insufficient, or as loved, or as someone who consistently disappoints the people who matter. The self, the continuous, apparently stable entity that each person experiences as what they are, is also a product of this retrieval. It is not a fixed thing that the thought reports on. It is something that thought continuously constructs. This seems, at first, like it should be frightening. If the self is a construction from memory, then what are you, actually? But Krishnamurti was not making a nihilistic point. He was making a practical one. If you know that the image you carry of yourself is made of thought, made of memory, made of language, made of other people's assessments absorbed over decades, then you can look at it with a little more lightness. The image is not wrong. It is not your enemy. It is simply not the last word. The American philosopher William James, writing in 1890 inches, his great textbook, The Principles of Psychology, described consciousness as a stream, not a chain of discrete thoughts, but a continuous flow, one moment shading into the next, thoughts arising and passing with the continuity and inevitability of water moving through a channel. He was right about the flow. What Krishnamurti added 60 years later was a question about the channel itself. Who built it? And is it as fixed as it feels? Consider the thought that has been most active in your mind this evening, not directing you toward any particular thought, just noticing that there probably was one, a worry about something, or a replaying of something, or a planning of something. That thought arrived out of somewhere, out of the archive of what you know and what you fear and what you have learned to want. It had a particular flavor because you are a particular person who has had particular experiences. It is, in that sense, yours, but it arrived. You did not choose it. It rose up from the machinery and presented itself as urgent. Thought does this. It presents itself as urgent. It presents itself as the most important thing in the field of awareness at this moment, requiring immediate attention. The question Krishnamurti kept asking, quietly, was, what happens when you watch the thought arriving instead of immediately entering it? What is the quality of the watching? Your breath now. The slow expansion of the chest. The release. This movement was happening before you noticed it, and it will continue without instruction. That continuation, that happening that does not require the thinking mind to manage it, is a useful thing to rest in, briefly, between thoughts. Chapter 9. The Watcher and the Watched. If your mind has been elsewhere for a moment, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. Still in the same quiet. There is a distinction Krishnamurti returned to more persistently than almost any other, and it is worth approaching slowly. He spoke about it in Ojai in the 1940s, and in Sanan in the 1970s, and in Madras in the 1980s. Each time with the same care, each time finding slightly new language for something that resisted language, but was, he insisted, directly observable by anyone who looked. The distinction is between the watcher and the watched. When you observe your own thinking, when you step back, as it were, from a thought and notice that you are having it, there seems to be two things: the thought and the one observing the thought. The thought being watched and the watcher watching it. This seems obvious. Of course, there are two things: you and the thought you are having. Krishnamurti's question was, are there actually two things? Look more carefully, he would say. in those quiet auditoriums. Look at the watcher itself. When you look at the entity that is watching the thought, what do you find? You find another thought. A thought about the watcher, a commentary on the watching. Another voice, produced by the same machinery, that is now describing the process of observation as though it were separate from the process being observed. The watcher is not outside the process looking in. The watcher is made of the same material as what it is watching. He called this the observer and the observed. And the central point he kept trying to communicate, the thing he would come back to after elaborate tangents, patiently, as though returning to a fire that kept going out, is that the observer and the observed are not two separate things. They are one movement of the mind, artificially divided by language into a subject and an object. We will come back to the moment when this division collapses. It is the most significant thing Krishnamurti pointed at, and it requires a particular quality of stillness to approach. Not the stillness that is achieved through effort, which is just tension wearing a quieter face. The stillness that arrives when the mind is genuinely interested in something and has, for the moment, stopped performing interest and become it. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal, a document we know as the Meditations, composed in a military tent on the Danube frontier sometime around 170 CE, used a similar practice of watching. He would hold a thought at arm's length and examine it the way a craftsman examines a piece of material before using it. Is this thought true? Is it useful? Does it serve the good? He did not fuse with his thoughts. He looked at them. The Meditations are the private record of a man in a position of enormous public power who had developed, through decades of Stoic practice, the ability to watch his own mind with something like an engineer's dispassion. Krishnamurti and Marcus Aurelius arrive at their watching from different directions, one through Greek philosophy filtered through Rome, one through a direct investigation of consciousness that owed nothing to any tradition. But both are pointing at the same faculty, the capacity to see a thought without being immediately absorbed into it, to hold it, briefly, at a small distance from identification. This faculty is already operating in you. It is what allows you to notice that you were thinking a moment ago about something other than this voice. The noticing is the faculty. The moment of returning from distraction, that small, unpressured return, is itself an instance of what both of these men were pointing toward. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the surface beneath you, the specific temperature of the air, the particular darkness of the room. The watcher and the watched will meet again later tonight. For now, the body, the breath, the simple fact of being horizontal in a warm place at the end of a long day. Chapter 10. The conditioned mind. There is a word Krishnamurti used more than almost any other across 60 years of teaching, and it is worth understanding clearly before we go further. The word is conditioned. The conditioned mind. Conditioned thought. The conditioning that prevents the mind from seeing freshly. He used it the way a doctor uses the word inflammation as a description of a specific process that has specific causes and specific effects, not as a moral judgment. The conditioned mind is not a bad mind. It is not a failed mind. It is a mind that has been shaped inevitably and comprehensively by every experience it has had since birth. From the first months of life, the brain is absorbing the language of the household, the emotional temperature of the early relationships. The beliefs about the world that are communicated not only through words, but through behavior, through what the adults around a child get anxious about, what they celebrate, what they refuse to discuss, what they find funny, what they find shameful. All of this is absorbed continuously and becomes the architecture of the mind that the adult then inhabits without knowing most of the time that it is architecture and not simply the shape of reality. By the time a person is 20 or 30, the conditioning is deep. It runs in the background of every thought, shaping what the mind notices and what it ignores, what it fears and what it wants, what kind of silence feels comfortable and what kind feels threatening. It is not visible from inside. This is its most important characteristic. From inside the conditioned mind, the conditioning looks like truth. Krishnamurti was not the first to make this observation. Sigmund Freud, working in Vienna from the 1880s onward, identified a version of the same problem, that the early experiences of the child shape the unconscious in ways the adult cannot directly see, and that much of what feels like free choice or authentic feeling is in fact the expression of patterns laid down long before the person had any capacity to evaluate them. Freud's therapeutic method, the long-talking cure, was an attempt to make the invisible visible, to bring the conditioning into the light where it could be examined. Krishnamurti's method, if it can be called a method, was different. He was not interested in excavating the particular content of the conditioning, not interested in which specific childhood experiences produced which specific patterns. He was interested in the conditioning itself as a process, in whether the mind could become aware of its own conditioned nature as a whole, not piece by piece. The difference is important. Freud's approach says, find the specific hidden thing, understand it, and that specific piece of conditioning loses its power. Krishnamurti's approach asks, can the mind become aware that it is conditioned entirely, completely, all the way through, without needing to trace every strand to its origin? Because the moment the mind sees its own conditioned nature completely, something in the structure of the conditioning shifts. The question is not answerable in a single night, but the question is worth holding. What have you absorbed over the years that you have never questioned because it arrived before you had the capacity to question? What does the inside of your inherited house look like, now that you are old enough to notice the architecture? Nothing in this question requires you to be anxious. The house is the house. It has served you. It continues to serve you. Knowing that it is a house does not make it less real. It makes it very slightly less inescapable. Consider the particular conditioning that runs in the background of very late nights. The cultural conditioning that says, rest is lazy, lying awake is wasted time, the person who is not productive is failing. This conditioning is so deep in the fabric of modern life that it runs even in the hours specifically designated for rest. The mind, lying in the bed it has been told it should be grateful for, is still subject to the voice that says it should be doing something more useful, something that will count. This conditioning was not inevitable. Other cultures have held rest as sacred. Other eras have treated sleep as a form of wisdom rather than a concession to weakness. The specific shape your conditioning takes is the product of a specific historical moment and a specific cultural formation. Neither is natural. Neither is the truth about what rest is or what a human life requires. They are the rooms that were built around you before you were old enough to notice the walls. Chapter 11. The Weight of Yesterday. Most of the weight the mind carries tonight is not from today. Today's events have their weight, the conversation that went sideways, the task that stayed unfinished, the small disappointment, or the larger one that settled somewhere behind the sternum and has not quite dislodged since. These are real. They have texture and gravity and the particular taste of the present tense. But beneath them, and often running much louder, is the older weight, the accumulated freight of years. The long record of what happened and was not fully digested, the slow build-up of assessments and comparisons and conclusions about who you are and what you deserve and what is reasonable to expect. Krishnamurti called this the burden of the past. He was not using past as a spiritual category or a therapeutic term. He meant it literally, the past as psychological time, as the contents of memory that the mind carries into each present moment and uses to interpret what is happening now. The past as memory is enormously useful for practical purposes. It is how you know your name and your address and how to operate the machinery of daily life. But the past as weight is something else. It is the layer of interpretation that arrives simultaneously with experience and tells you what the experience means before you have actually fully had it. You meet someone new and the past is already interpreting. This person reminds you of someone, their manner triggers something, a very old pattern of expectation activates before the conversation has properly begun. You walk into a room and the past has already decided the temperature before you have checked. You receive news and the past's running commentary is louder than the news itself, framing what it means for who you are, what it confirms, what it threatens. This is not a flaw. It is how the brain's pattern-matching system functions, and that system has kept the species alive. But at 11 p.m., lying in the dark, the pattern-matching system is still running on problems that are not present, still scanning for threats in a room that contains only a warm body and a dark ceiling, still composing responses to people who are asleep on the other side of the city. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in a letter he wrote in 1903 to a young student named Franz Capus, a letter that would eventually become part of the collection known as Letters to a Young Poet, said something that belongs in this a neighborhood. He said, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, not to force the answers, which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Krishnamurti would not have said it quite this way. He was more interested in looking at the questions than in loving them. But the underlying invitation is similar. The unsolved things do not need to be solved tonight. Tonight, they can simply be what they are: unresolved, present, real, and not requiring immediate resolution. The weight of yesterday is real. It does not disappear because you lie down, but it does not require your active participation to continue existing. It will still be there in the morning, reliably. You are not responsible for keeping it in place through the night. Let the jaw soften now. The eyes, behind the closed lids, can release the small tension they have been holding since sometime this afternoon. The weight of yesterday can rest on the floor beside the bed. It will be there when you need it. There is a particular form of yesterday weight that operates in what might be called the accounting mind. The mind that, at midnight, is still running the ledger. What was promised and not delivered. What was received and not deserved. What should have been said and wasn't. What was said and shouldn't have been. The accounting is not malicious. It is the mind doing what it was trained to do. Keep track, maintain fairness, ensure that the record is correct. The accounting mind is the same mind that manages the calendar and the budget and the obligations of ordinary life. It is genuinely useful during the daylight hours. At midnight, the account cannot be settled. The other parties are asleep. The transactions cannot be renegotiated. The ledger will look exactly the same in the morning as it does right now, and it will still be there, reliable and complete when the conditions exist to actually address it. The accounting can wait. The accountant can rest. Chapter 12. Time, Sorrow, and the Clock. Krishnamurti made an observation about sorrow that took people a long time to absorb because it cuts across almost everything the culture says about grief and loss and the management of painful experience. He said, in effect, that sorrow is maintained by time, not caused by time. It is caused by whatever loss or failure or disappointment produced it, but maintained by it, kept alive and kept suffering by the mind's habit of moving the painful event from the past into the present and back again, comparing what is now to what was before, measuring the distance between the two, concluding that the distance is the problem and that the problem cannot be resolved until the distance is somehow closed. This is the structure of ordinary grief. The thing that is gone was good, and now it is gone, and the awareness of its absence is the ache. The mind moves between what was and what is back and forth. And the moving is the suffering. Not the original loss which happened once and is finished, but the continuous return to it, the continuous measurement of what remains against what existed before. He was not saying that grief is avoidable or that loss should not hurt. He was saying something more precise, that the ongoing suffering of grief, the suffering that continues long after the initial loss, that becomes chronic and finds its way into the texture of ordinary days, is maintained by thought, by the mind's movement in time. by the habit of carrying what happened into every present moment and using it as the lens through which the present moment is evaluated. And then he asked the question that made the observation useful: what happens if the movement stops? Not through suppression, not through deciding not to think about the painful thing, which simply drives it underground, where it continues to operate invisibly, but through actually seeing the movement, the back and forth between then and now, the continuous measurement, and recognizing it as a movement that thought is making rather than a fixed condition of reality. The French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, writing in the mid-20th century and working in a territory completely different from Krishnamurti's, arrived at a related insight from a different angle. In her notebooks, collected posthumously as Gravity and Grace, she wrote about what she called affliction, a word she distinguished carefully from mere suffering. Affliction, in her usage, is suffering that has attached itself to the soul and reshaped it, become not an event the person is having, but something the person has become. She thought the way out of affliction was not resolution, but attention, a quality of complete, uncalculating attention to what is actually present, rather than to the story the mind tells about what is present. The clock in the room, if there is one, is doing what clocks do. The night outside the window is doing what nights do. The body in the bed is warm and real and breathing with the reliability of something that does not need to be reminded. The past is in the past. Not inaccessible, it is all right there in the archive, but not required to be active at this particular hour. Let the breath lengthen, not forcing it, simply noticing that the body, when the mind releases its grip slightly, tends to breathe a little more slowly. This has always been true. The body knows something about rest that the mind keeps trying to learn. Epictetus taught his students in Nicopolis in the 2nd century CE that the chief task of philosophy was not to understand the world, but to understand the one doing the understanding. Not because the world is unimportant, but because the instrument through which the world is known, the mind, the perceptions, the judgments, shapes everything that the instrument reports back. A poorly calibrated instrument gives distorted readings. A well-calibrated one gives clear ones. The work of calibration is the work of philosophy, as Epictetus understood it. Krishnamurti would have agreed with this while pushing past it. The calibration is not achieved through discipline applied to the instrument. It is achieved through seeing the instrument as it actually is. The distortion does not disappear because we work hard to eliminate it. It disappears when we see clearly enough that the distorted reading is a distorted reading and not a fact. Chapter 13, Simone Weil and the Factory Floor. In the autumn of 1934, a young French philosophy teacher named Simone Weil did something that puzzled almost everyone who knew her. She resigned her teaching post at a lycée in Rouen, took a leave of absence, and went to work on the assembly line at a Renault automobile factory in the Paris suburbs. She was not doing this as research. She was not writing a book about labor. She had decided that she could not, in good conscience, write or teach about suffering and human dignity without having experienced, in her own body, the particular kind of suffering that industrial factory work produces. She wanted to know what it feels like from the inside. Not from observation, not from interviews, not from reading the reports of social scientists, from inside. What she found was not what she expected, which is part of what makes it so useful. She expected to find that factory work was degrading because it was repetitive and poorly paid and physically exhausting. All of that was true. But what she found underneath those obvious facts was something more fundamental. The factory destroyed thought. Not by being stupid, the work required a specific, narrow concentration that was actually quite demanding. It destroyed thought by making that narrow concentration compulsory for every hour of the working day, leaving no room for the kind of free, wandering, speculative thinking that is, she concluded, the condition for genuine interior life. The workers were not simply tired, they were systematically prevented by the structure of the work from being fully human, from being the kind of being that can reflect on its own experience. She wrote about this in her notebooks, which were eventually collected and published after her death as Gravity and Grace. And in those notebooks, she wrote what is perhaps her most quoted line, a sentence she included in a letter to a poet named Joe. Bousquet in 1942, when she was in exile in England and he was bedridden with a war wound that had paralyzed him for 20 years. She wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." She meant it in a specific, rigorous sense. Attention in her writing is not the same as interest or focus or concentration. It is a quality of complete, uncalculating presence to whatever is in front of you, a presence that does not rush toward judgment or interpretation or the imposition of the self's own needs onto the reality of what is there. This kind of attention is genuinely rare. It is rare because the machinery of thought, the conditioned mind, as Krishnamurti would say, is almost always moving ahead of the present moment, interpreting before it has fully received, judging before it has fully seen. The connection to Krishnamurti is not incidental. They were near contemporaries who never met and who came from completely different traditions. She from French Catholic intellectual life and Jewish heritage, he from the dissolution of a theosophical movement in a field in Holland. But both of them kept arriving at the same faculty, the capacity for attention that is not already occupied with itself. The quality of presence that is not simultaneously running a commentary on its own presence. In Freedom from the Known, his 1969 book, Krishnamurti wrote, in effect, that to listen to what another person is saying, really listen, without already preparing a response, is one of the most demanding and most liberating things the mind can do. Because in the moment of genuine listening, the self-referential machinery is temporarily suspended. The me that is comparing this to other things and evaluating whether this is useful and deciding what it means for my life. That machinery pauses, and in the pause, something sees clearly. Let the body sink a little further into wherever it rests. You do not need to follow every word perfectly. The mind at the edge of sleep receives differently than the alert mind. Let what is useful arrive. Let the rest pass. The space between words is as real as the words themselves. Chapter 14. The thinker is the thought. Here is the most radical thing Krishnamurti kept trying to say. He said it in many forms, in many languages, over many decades. Stripped to its simplest. The thinker is the thought. This needs to be approached slowly. There is a very strong feeling, almost universal, that when you are thinking, there are two things happening simultaneously. The thinking and you. You, the thinker, are doing the thinking. The thoughts are your tools or your products, arising in the field of your consciousness, which you experience as a kind of space that thoughts move through. The thoughts come and go. You remain. The you is what persists when the thinking changes. The thoughts are what changes. This distinction feels obvious. It feels like the foundation of what a person is. Krishnamurti asked, "Look more carefully. When you look for the thinker behind the thoughts, what do you find?" He said, "You find another thought. A thought that says, I am the one thinking this. A thought that presents itself as the witness, as the enduring observer, as the stable center around which the changing thoughts rotate. But this witness is itself produced by the same thought machinery as the thoughts it claims to be witnessing. It is not outside the process looking in. It is part of the process, playing the role of the one who is outside. This is a difficult thing to see. It is difficult not because it requires great intelligence, but because it requires looking in a direction the mind has not been trained to look. The mind is very good at looking outward, at problems, at relationships, at the world. It is trained through years of education and socialization to solve things, fix things, improve things, manage things. It is almost entirely untrained at looking at itself with the same dispassion it brings to external problems. But when that looking is turned inward, when the mind looks at the mind, something strange and illuminating occurs. The thing being looked at changes in the act of being looked at. Not because the looking creates a new reality, because the looking reveals that the thing you were looking for, the stable, separate thinker behind the thoughts, was not there in the way you assumed. What was there was the process itself. Thinking, observing, thinking about the observing, thinking about the thinking about the observing, a continuous recursion with no fixed center. The French philosopher René Descartes concluded in 1637 that the one thing he could be certain of was the thinking. I think, therefore I am. The act of doubting, of questioning everything, proved the existence of a doubter. Krishnamurti was asking about the doubter. Not doubting that there is doubting, but asking, what is the doubter made of, and is it what it believes itself to be? You have had the experience, probably, of being so absorbed in something, a task, a conversation, a piece of music, a physical activity that required total attention, that the usual sense of yourself as a separate witness temporarily disappeared. Not frightening, quite the opposite. The disappearance of the sense of self as witness is typically described as a relief, as lightness, as the opposite of burden. This is what Krishnamurti was pointing at, the relief that occurs when the constructed witness relaxes. When the mind is not simultaneously doing something and monitoring itself doing it and evaluating whether it is doing it correctly and comparing it to how it has done it before and projecting how it might do it in the future, when the doing is simply the doing without the witness adding its layer, the breath, right now, simply the breath. Not a breath that is being witnessed and evaluated and compared. Just the actual movement which was happening without all of that commentary and continues to happen whether the commentary runs or not. Augustine of Hippo, writing his Confessions in the late 4th century CE, described the restlessness of a mind in search of something it could not name. He wrote in his opening pages the line that has been translated and retranslated for 16 centuries. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. For Augustine, the resting place was God. But the restlessness he described, the continuous motion of a mind that cannot settle, that achieves things and finds them insufficient, that reaches toward something and finds the reaching continues past the thing reached, is recognizable regardless of what theology one holds or does not hold. The restlessness is the human condition. What Krishnamurti was asking is, what does the restlessness need exactly? And is the thing it keeps reaching for actually what it is reaching for? Chapter 15. What fear is made of. Fear, Krishnamurti said, is always about time. Not the immediate physical fear that arises when actual danger is present, the sudden sharpening of attention when something unexpected happens, the body's instantaneous response to threat. That fear is appropriate. It is the organism protecting itself, and it does not linger unless the threat lingers. He was interested in the other kind, the fear that is not about what is happening now, but about what might happen. The fear that lives in the future, in scenarios that have not occurred and may not occur, but which the mind visits with a persistence and vividness that makes them feel nearly as solid as events. This fear, psychological fear, fear as a chronic state of the interior life, is almost entirely constructed from thought. Thought reaches into the future, arranges various possible scenarios, evaluates which ones are threatening, and then presents the most threatening one to the consciousness as though it were already happening. The body responds as though it were already happening. The heart rate shifts slightly, the breathing shallows. The muscles prepare themselves for something that is entirely imaginary. This is the structure of most of the fear that keeps people awake at night. Not a present danger, a projected one, a thought about what might happen, which arrives in the body as though it were happening. The insight Krishnamurti kept returning to is this: the fear and the thought are not two separate things. There is not thought on one side and then fear arriving as a response. The thought and the fear are one movement. The thought is partially constituted by the fear, and the fear is maintained by the thought. When the thought stops, not suppressed, not pushed away, but actually seen through, understood, followed all the way to its conclusion, the fear that was inseparable from it also stops. Not because the future has become safer, because the mental activity that was producing the frightening future has temporarily ceased. Consider the worry that has visited you most reliably this week. Not the worry itself, you do not need to enter it right now. Just notice its general shape. It is almost certainly about something that has not happened yet, or about the continuation of something that is happening, or about the consequences of something that has happened. In every case, it lives primarily in time, in a before or an after, and the mind is using thought to travel into that time and experience it as though it were present. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, writing letters in the 1st century CE to his friend Lucilius, made an observation that has been quoted so often it risks losing its precision. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Not merely that we worry unnecessarily, but that the mechanism of imagination, the mind's capacity to construct vivid, embodied versions of events that have not occurred, is so powerful that it produces genuine suffering from scenarios that exist only in the mind's theatre. Krishnamurti's contribution to this insight is the practical one. If fear is a movement of thought, and if thought is something that can be watched rather than immediately entered, then the watching is itself the interruption. Not a forced interruption, not clenching the mind around the instruction not to think the fearful thought which simply strengthens it, but a genuine watching with the quality of attention Simone Weil described, uncalculating, unjudging, complete. Watch the fear. Not as though you are separate from it, remember. The watcher and the watched are the same movement. But watch it in the sense of giving it complete attention, not pushing it away and not entering it, just here it is. This is what it is, this is what it does, this is the shape it makes in the mind. Something changes when that happens, not always immediately, but the fear that is fully attended to without the added layer of fear about the fear tends to reveal its constructed nature. And constructions, when seen as constructions, are a little less solid. The room is dark and warm, and the night is doing what nights do. Nothing is required of the body tonight except this: to rest in the dark and breathe. Chapter 16, The Anxiety of Tomorrow. If your mind has been elsewhere, come back. No pressure. The night is long enough. We are still here, and the following is the part I wanted you to hear. Most of the anxiety that visits a person late at night is not about today. Today is finished. Whatever happened in it has happened, and the record is set. The anxiety of late night is almost always about tomorrow. What needs to happen, what might not happen, what could go wrong, what will be required of you before you have fully rested from what was required today. The mind, lying in the dark with nothing useful to do, turns its full planning apparatus toward tomorrow and begins to construct it. Not passively, actively. The planning mind is a skilled builder. It can make tomorrow feel so real, so immediate, so fully furnished with consequence and expectation that the body responds to it as though it were present, as though morning had already arrived, with all its demands already in motion. This is a very old human problem. The clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia record anxieties about harvests and debts and relationships that would be familiar to anyone lying awake in any century since. The monks of medieval Europe wrote about what they called acedia, a kind of restless, spiraling mental agitation that was considered one of the primary obstacles to contemplative life. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle and persistent and very good at disguising itself as reasonable concern. Krishnamurti was not the first person to notice that the mind moves into tomorrow and mistakes the movement for the thing itself. But he was one of the most precise about what to do, or rather, what not to do about it. He would not recommend fighting the anxiety. He would not recommend replacing the anxious thought with a better thought, or directing the mind toward a calming image, or breathing in a pattern designed to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. These things may help temporarily, but they address the surface, not the structure. They calm the specific wave without asking what ocean the wave is rising from. What he would recommend, what he consistently pointed toward, is earlier. It is before the decision to fight or accept, before the choice of method. It is simply look at the anxiety. Look at the structure of it. Notice that it is a movement of thought into future time. Notice that the thing it is anxious about does not exist yet and may not exist. Notice that the suffering being experienced right now, the elevated heart rate, the tightened chest, the narrowed attention, is entirely produced by a scenario that is constructed, not actual. Not to dismiss the scenario, not to pretend the future is not real, but to see very clearly that what is happening right now is a thought, and that thought is an activity that is occurring in the present moment, not in the future moment it is describing. The future that is worrying you is happening now, in this room, in this body. And it is a mental activity, not a fact. The ending of this particular sorrow, the sorrow of tomorrow's anxiety arriving tonight, is not in tomorrow. It is not in resolving the problem the mind is constructing. It is in seeing the construction clearly enough that the mind loses its conviction that the construction is the problem. We will find where the ending actually lives before this night is finished. For now, notice the body. Notice that it is warm, that the chest is moving, that the darkness of the room is actual darkness, not the darkness of anything threatening, just the ordinary dark that nights are made of. Tomorrow is 12 hours away, at least. It can wait. Chapter 17. Security and its shadows. One of the things the conditioned mind wants most, Krishnamurti observed, is security. Not just physical security, shelter, food, warmth, the ordinary material conditions of a livable life, but psychological security, the feeling of being sure, of knowing what is real, what is true, what can be depended upon, the feeling of having solid ground. This desire is not a weakness. It makes sense. A human being is a remarkably fragile organism navigating a world that is genuinely unpredictable, and the desire for some stable reference point, something that will not shift, some truth that is permanent, is a reasonable response to that predicament. The problem Krishnamurti kept pointing to is that the ways the mind typically tries to achieve this security are precisely the ways that perpetuate insecurity. The mind reaches for a belief, a fixed set of ideas about how reality works, what values matter, what the self essentially is, and holds on to the belief as the stable ground. But beliefs are made of thought, and thought, as we have been looking at, is a response from memory, changeable, conditioned, partial. Believing in a belief does not make it permanent. It makes it defended. The defense of belief is where a great deal of human suffering is generated. The person who needs their particular understanding of reality to be correct is made anxious by everything that challenges it. Every different perspective becomes a threat. Every fact that does not fit the belief must be discounted or reinterpreted. The more rigidly the belief is held, the more the person has made the belief the foundation of their psychological security, the more exhausting and frightening the encounter with difference becomes. Krishnamurti was not recommending that people abandon all beliefs and live in a relativist fog. He was making a more specific observation, that psychological security cannot be found in anything the thought can produce, because thought itself is not permanent. The security that thought provides is always conditional, always dependent on the continued plausibility of the ideas that produce it. And conditions change. What he pointed toward as genuine security was something different. Not the security of certainty, of having the right beliefs firmly in place, but the security of a mind that is comfortable with not knowing. That can be in the presence of uncertainty without needing the uncertainty to be immediately resolved. That can hold an open question the way the hands hold something delicate, firmly enough to keep it, lightly enough not to break it. The philosopher and psychologist Carl Rogers, working in America in the 1950s and 1960s, and building what he called person-centered therapy, identified something similar in the therapeutic relationship. He found that the most powerful thing a therapist could offer a patient was not expertise or correct interpretation, but what he called unconditional positive regard, a quality of acceptance that did not depend on the patient being a particular way. A presence that was, in effect, genuinely secure enough to not need the other person to change. This quality of security, the security that does not require the world to be a particular way in order to feel stable, is available to the person lying in the dark tonight. Not as an achievement, not as something to be constructed, but as a quality that is already present whenever the constructed forms of security, the defended beliefs, the insisted upon certainties are set aside for a moment. The room is what it is, the night is what it is. You are what you are, right now, without needing to be otherwise. There is a specific quality of late-night insecurity that deserves its own attention. The feeling at this hour that things are fundamentally less under control than they appeared during the day. During the day, the activity of managing and deciding and acting creates a feeling of agency, a feeling that the self is moving through the world with at least some degree of effectiveness. At midnight, the managing stops. The activity stops. And in the stillness, the underlying uncertainty that the activity was in part keeping at bay, becomes more audible. This is not a malfunction. This is what nights are for. The uncertainty was always there. The day's activity was layered on top of it, not hiding it, but simply being louder. The night removes the layer and lets the quiet uncertainty be what it is. A basic, unavoidable feature of being a conscious organism in an unpredictable world. It cannot be fixed. It can be sat with, and sitting with it clearly without adding the additional distress of needing it to be otherwise is its own form of rest. Chapter 18. The river does not ask. There is a story Krishnamurti told in various forms across many years of public speaking. He told it so often, not because he was attached to it, but because it described something that was easier to approach through image than through argument. In Madras, in one of the talks he gave there in the 1970s, he described going for a walk in the hills near Ojai, California, where he spent part of each year, and coming to a small river. He sat beside the river for some time. He watched the water move. He noticed that the water moved around what was in its path, around stones, around fallen branches, around the variations of the riverbed, without hesitating, without deciding, without choosing to go around. It simply moved. The movement was the response. The response was total. Nothing was held back, nothing was calculated. The river did not ask whether going around this particular stone was the right approach. It simply moved, and the movement was complete. He was pointing at something about action that does not originate from thought, not reckless action, not impulsive action. Action that arises directly from what is present, without the intermediary of the self consulting its preferences. The river is not consulting its preferences. The river is simply moving. In the 60 years he spent teaching, Krishnamurti never tired of drawing attention to the gap between the natural fluency of the physical world and the extraordinary complication of the human interior. A tree grows toward light without deciding to. A river finds its level without consulting a map. The body breathes without being instructed. These processes move with a completeness and a certainty that the thinking mind, with all its extraordinary capabilities, almost never achieves, because the thinking mind is always running ahead of the present moment, looking backward and forward simultaneously, checking the movement against the archive and the projection, and finding it either insufficient or threatening or in need of adjustment. Krishnamurti was not romanticizing nature or suggesting that people should be like rivers. He was using the river to make visible, by contrast, the particular quality of human thought that perpetually interrupts its own movement. The philosopher Lao Tzu, writing in ancient China in a text we know as the Tao Te Ching, a text that exists in many translations and whose precise dating is uncertain, but whose wisdom has been circulating for at least 2,500 years, wrote about water as the supreme model of effective action. Water, he observed, is the softest substance in the world, and yet it wears away the hardest stone, not through aggression, through constancy. Through moving in the direction that is natural to it, without resistance, without force, without a plan. This is very close to what Krishnamurti pointed at with his river story. Not the passive acceptance of whatever happens, not the abandonment of intelligent, responsive action, but action that arises from a quality of attention that is not divided, that is not simultaneously doing and monitoring and evaluating and comparing, simply moving, simply responding, simply being whatever this moment requires. The body in the bed is doing something like this. The heart is beating, the lungs are moving, the blood is making its faithful circuits. All of this is happening without the thinking mind's management, and it is happening with extraordinary precision and reliability. The body, left to itself, knows what to do. The thinking mind, tonight, can follow the body's lead. It can simply be here, in this warm room, moving through the dark toward morning without needing to manage the movement. Let the shoulders release. Let the hands unclench whatever they have been holding from long habit since this afternoon. Nothing needs holding right now. The river does not hold the stones. It moves around them and continues. The philosopher Zhuangzi, writing in ancient China somewhere in the 4th century BCE, a contemporary roughly of Aristotle, and not far removed in time from Lao Tzu, told a story about a cook who had been cutting up oxen for 19 years without dulling his cleaver. Not because he was a uniquely skilled craftsman, though he was skilled, but because he had learned to follow the natural structure of what he was working with. He found the spaces between the joints, the places where the blade could move without resistance, and he worked there. His cleaver never met the bone directly. It followed the grain of the thing. This is another approach to the quality Krishnamurti was pointing at. The action that moves with what is, rather than against it. The response that follows the actual shape of the situation, rather than the shape the mind has decided the situation should be. The cleaver that finds the natural opening rather than forcing an unnatural one. Chapter 19, William, James, and the Stream. In 1870, William James was 28 years old and very close to not surviving himself. He had been unwell for years, not physically ill in any diagnosable sense, but caught in a philosophical despair so complete that he had stopped being able to find a reason to continue. He was the son of a remarkable father, Henry James Sr., who had unorthodox spiritual ideas and enormous intellectual energy, and perhaps inadvertently made the task of being his son feel like a competition that could not be won. James had studied medicine and hated it. He had traveled to Brazil with the naturalist Louis Agassiz and been miserable there. He had returned and sat in his father's house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, reading German philosophy and becoming increasingly convinced that the universe was deterministic, that the self was an illusion, and that free will, the foundation of any life that felt worth living, was a philosophical fiction. On the 30th of April 1870, he wrote in his diary something that has since become one of the most quoted entries in the history of American philosophy. He wrote that he would commit to believing in free will entirely as his first act of free will, that he would choose to act as though choice were real, as though a person's decisions actually made a difference to the shape of their life, and that he would hold this chosen belief firmly enough to build on it. He was not arguing that free will is metaphysically certain. He knew it was not. He was arguing that the decision to live as though it were real was itself a kind of free will, and that was enough. From that decision, slowly and then rapidly, he built one of the most significant intellectual careers of the 19th century. He became the founding figure of American psychology, the creator of pragmatism as a philosophical school, the author of The Principles of Psychology and The Varieties of Religious Experience, and a dozen other books that changed how a civilization thought about the mind and consciousness and the nature of belief. The central metaphor he introduced in The Principles, the one that has entered the language so completely that most people use it without knowing where it came from, is the stream of consciousness. Thought, he argued, is not a chain of discrete beads strung in sequence. It is a continuous flow, one state shading into the next, with the quality and character of a river rather than a machine. The past thought is always influencing the present one. The emotional tone of one moment colors the next. Consciousness does not stop and start, it flows. Krishnamurti knew James's work, at least indirectly, through the broad currents of 20th century psychological thinking that James's ideas had generated. And Krishnamurti would have agreed with the stream metaphor while pushing it one step further. If consciousness flows, then the apparent division of the stream into a me who is experiencing the stream, and the stream itself is an artificial division, a grammatical convenience that has been mistaken for an actual fact. There is the flowing. The flowing does not require a separate owner. Think about the last time you were completely absorbed in something. Completely, not performing absorption, not watching yourself be absorbed, but actually inside it, the boundary between you and the activity temporarily dissolved. A physical task done with full attention. A conversation that became genuinely interesting. A moment in nature where the difference between observer and observed briefly fell away. That dissolution was not a loss. It was a relief. The overhead of maintaining the separation between the one experiencing and the experience itself is heavier than we generally notice. When it lifts, what remains is lighter. James eventually recovered from his despair. He lived until 1910, when he died at 68, at his farm in Chocorua, New Hampshire, having written more and lived more fully than almost anyone in the history of American intellectual life. He chose to believe in free will, and the belief carried him. The belief you choose tonight can be simpler than that. It can simply be this: sleep is possible. The body knows how. The mind can let it. Chapter 20. Awareness without a center. There is a quality of awareness that does not belong to anyone. This is one of the most difficult things Krishnamurti tried to communicate, and he returned to it in the final years of his teaching with a particular intensity, as though the time available to say it was shortening and the thing itself was more important than any other thing he had said. In talks in Ojai and in Madras in the 1980s, in the last years before his death in 1986, He kept circling this. Awareness without a center. Attention that is not being done by a self to an object, but is simply present, without a source and without a target. This sounds abstract. It sounds like mystical fog, which is exactly the kind of language Krishnamurti spent his life avoiding. But he insisted it was the most practical and the most observable thing he knew. He arrived at it through the question we have been circling all night. If the observer is made of thought, and the observed is also made of thought, and thought is one continuous movement without a fixed center, then what is the awareness that is aware of all this? Not the thought that says, I am aware. That is another thought. But the quality of awareness itself, which must already be present before any thought can occur. He did not claim this was mystical. He claimed it was simply what happens when the mind stops generating a center. When the self-maintenance project, the continuous activity of producing and defending and elaborating the image of oneself temporarily ceases, what remains is not nothing, it is awareness. Clear, present, undirected, belonging to no one. Zen Buddhism points at something similar, though from a direction that uses paradox rather than analysis. The koan, the impossible question the Zen student is given to sit with, is designed to frustrate the conceptual mind into releasing its grip, after which something the tradition calls original mind becomes visible. Not produced, not achieved, revealed by the cessation of the usual production. Krishnamurti was not a Buddhist and was impatient with the framework of any tradition. But the state being pointed at is recognizable across traditions precisely because it is not the product of any tradition. It is what is already there when the activity of the conditioned mind pauses. You have touched this. Perhaps you have touched it many times without recognizing it as significant. Because it is characteristically quiet, it does not announce itself, does not produce dramatic experiences, does not feel especially special. It feels, most typically, very ordinary. The ordinary awareness of being alive without anything added, the quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the absence of the inner monologue. This is what the edge of sleep sometimes opens onto. Not every night, not reliably, but in the moments when the thinking mind has exhausted its material, when it has reviewed everything it can review and planned everything it can plan and still not found what it was looking for, there is sometimes a falling away, a moment of simple presence. The room, the darkness, the breath. Awareness without anyone being particularly aware. This is close. This is very close to where tonight is going. Let the mind rest. Not rest as in stopping. Stopping is not something you can do, and trying to stop makes more noise than simply allowing. But rest as in allowing what is already the case, that beneath the thinking, the reviewing, the planning, the anxiety of tomorrow and the weight of yesterday, there is a simple, quiet awareness that was here before any of that began and will be here when it stops. The Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi described a dream in which he was a butterfly, completely, convincingly, utterly a butterfly, with no knowledge that he was anything else. He woke from the dream and was a man again, and he sat with a question that he did not try to resolve. Was he a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or was he a butterfly dreaming now that he was a man? The question is not meant to be answered. It is meant to reveal something about the quality of the ordinary sense of self, the sense that there is a fixed center, a definite me, around which all experience organizes itself. Zhuangzi is pointing at the same absence of fixed center that Krishnamurti pointed at. The awareness that shifts with the dream, that is fully the butterfly and fully the man, without a permanent anchor. Chapter 21. The Lens and the Light. In the 1670s, in a small rented room in The Hague in the Netherlands, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza spent his evenings doing something very ordinary. He ground lenses. Glass lenses for spectacles and for microscopes and for telescopes, precise optical instruments that were in great demand in a century, fascinated with seeing clearly. He was good at it. The lens grinding was not a hobby or a distraction. It was how he paid his rent. It was also, people who knew him thought, a kind of philosophical practice, the daily work of making the instrument through which things can be seen more clearly. Spinoza had been excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656, at the age of 23, for reasons that were never fully specified in the formal document, but almost certainly related to his emerging conviction that God and nature were not separate, that the universe was not a creation made by a personal deity who stood outside it, but was itself an expression of a single, infinite substance, which Spinoza called God or nature interchangeably. This was not the kind of theology that any organized religion in 17th century Europe could accommodate. He was 23, and the doors of his community, the only community he had, closed behind him formally and permanently. He changed his name from Baruch, the Hebrew word for blessed, to Benedictus, the Latin word for the same thing. He moved to a smaller city. He ground lenses. He wrote. In his masterwork, Ethics, which was published only after his death in 1677, because he knew it would not survive publication during his lifetime, Spinoza made an observation about emotion that connects directly to what Krishnamurti was teaching 3 centuries later. He wrote, in effect, that an emotion ceases to be suffering the moment we form a clear and distinct picture of it, not that the emotion disappears when understood, but that its power to overwhelm, its tendency to take over the entire field of consciousness and become the only reality, diminishes in direct proportion to how clearly it is seen. This is the connection between Spinoza's lens grinding and Krishnamurti's looking. Both are about the quality of the seeing. The lens makes things visible that were previously too small or too distant to observe clearly. The kind of attention Krishnamurti pointed toward makes the interior life visible in the same way, not through a lens of glass and light, but through the quality of presence that stops judging and simply looks. The candle on Spinoza's workbench in The Hague has been out for 350 years. The glass dust that accumulated on his workbench has long since settled or dispersed. But the principle survives, very simply. Clarity is its own kind of relief. To see something clearly, even something difficult, is more restful than to live alongside it, unseen, half understood, half feared, like a shape in a dark room that might be anything. The shape in the dark room of your own mind, tonight, is nothing you have not already lived with. It is familiar. It has been there for years. What changes when it is seen clearly, when the attention turns toward it with the quality of a good lens rather than the quality of a frightened glance, is not the shape, but the relationship to it. The things that keep people from sleep are almost never new. They are old. They are the familiar faces of concerns that have been present in various forms for a long time. What can change is not the concerns, but the quality of looking. And that quality is available. It is available right now, in this room, in this dark. Chapter 22. What can finally rest? Remember the two kinds of tiredness. We have come to the second. We arrived at it early in the night, that distinction between the tiredness that belongs to the body and the tiredness that belongs to the mind. The body's tiredness yields to lying down. The mind's tiredness continues. And we noted that it continues not because the mind is broken or because you are doing something wrong, but because the mind is engaged in a particular activity, the activity of maintaining the self, of constructing and defending and elaborating the image of who you are and what you have and what you still need to secure before safety is finally possible. This maintenance is exhausting. Not dramatically exhausting. Not the exhaustion of physical labor or acute emotional pain. Quietly exhausting in the way that any continuous low-grade activity is exhausting when it never stops. The hum of a machine that runs all day and all night without a pause. What Krishnamurti kept pointing toward, with remarkable patience across 60 years, is that this activity is not required, not in the sense that you should stop it. You cannot stop it through deciding to stop it, but in the sense that it is an activity, not a necessity. The self does not need to be maintained in order to continue to exist. You will still be here in the morning, whether or not you spent this night managing and defending the image of who you are. The maintenance is something the conditioned mind does out of long habit and deep training, because it was taught at some very early point that this maintenance was survival. But tonight, for a few hours, the maintenance can pause. Not because you have achieved anything or understood anything perfectly or arrived at any state, but simply because you have been looking all night at what the maintenance actually is, at the machinery that runs it, the thought that produces it, the fear that motivates it. And looking clearly at something tends to change your relationship to it without any additional effort. Here is what can rest: the accounting. The running total of what has been done and not done, what is owed and not paid, what others think and whether they are right. The accounting is a legitimate activity that belongs in the daylight hours. At this hour, in this room, there is no transaction that requires management. Here is what can rest: the rehearsing, the replay of conversations, the pre-composition of conversations, not yet had, the editing and re-editing of what was said or should have been said or might be said in some future encounter. The rehearsal serves something in ordinary life. Right now it serves nothing and costs something. Here is what can rest: the measuring. The comparison of this life against other lives, this version of the self against the imagined better version, this moment against the moments that came before and seemed somehow more full or more true or more earned. The measuring is one of thought's most habitual movements and one of its most costly. All of these can rest. Not forever. Not as an achievement to be maintained, just for now. For the duration of this night, these activities can set themselves down and allow what is underneath them to be simply what it is. A warm body in a dark room, breathing steadily, approaching sleep, not requiring anything further from itself tonight. The first kind of tiredness has its resolution in the body's rest. The second kind has its resolution here in this releasing. Not a technique, a recognition. In On Becoming a Person, his 1961 book, Carl Rogers wrote about what he called the fully functioning person. Not a perfected person, not an achieved state, but a quality of being that is fully present to experience as it arrives, without the need to defend against it or shape it into something more acceptable. The fully functioning person does not need to be in control of their experience. They are simply in it, responding genuinely rather than performing an acceptable response. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most demanding things Rogers ever described. Because the alternative, the defended, managed, performance-based life, has so much cultural support that it feels like normality, and the fully present life feels, by contrast, like a radical act. But Rogers noted that the people who came closest to it tended to report not grandiosity or achievement, but something much quieter, a sense of being at home, of not being in conflict with themselves. Chapter 23. When the observer disappears, we came to the edge of this earlier in the night, and now we return to it, because the night has prepared the ground. The observer and the observed, Krishnamurti said, are one movement, not two things. One, the watcher is made of the same material as the watched, arises from the same source, serves the same conditioned purposes. When the mind watches its own fear, the watcher is not a separate, clean consciousness observing a dirty one. The watcher is constructed from the same fears it claims to be observing. The watching and the watched are one movement of thought, artificially divided by the grammar of the sentence into a subject and an object. And then something. What happens in the moment when this is actually seen? Not understood intellectually. Understanding it intellectually leaves the division intact, but actually seen in the way that a drawing suddenly reveals itself as a face when you have been seeing it as a vase, the moment when the structure reveals itself completely. Krishnamurti described this carefully in his later years, cautiously, because he did not want it to become a new goal to be achieved. He said, In the moment when the observer and the observed are genuinely seen as one, when the division is seen through rather than merely thought about, the quality of the moment changes. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would make a good story. The noise that the observer was making, the commentary, the evaluation, the running judgment on everything, including itself, stops. Not because it has been silenced, because the entity that was running it, the observer, has been seen through. What remains is not nothing. Krishnamurti was insistent about this. What remains is awareness. Clear, quiet, undirected awareness. Awareness that is not being done by anyone to anything. Simply the presence of awareness, the way a room has the presence of light when the light is on. The breath was happening before you paid attention to it. The awareness was happening before you turned attention on itself. These are not things you produced. They are what was already there. The moment the observer disappears, even briefly, even partially, there is a lightness. Not peace as an achievement, not calm as a produced state. Simply the absence of the weight that the observer was adding, the overhead of self-maintenance, lifting. This is what the edge of sleep sometimes opens onto, when the thinking mind exhausts itself and falls quiet before the dreaming mind begins. The interval between waking thought and dream thought. A moment of simple, bare, belonging to no one awareness. You are near that interval now. There have been moments in your life, brief, unremarkable, probably not labeled at the time, when this division was absent. When you were so fully present to what you were doing that the separation between the one doing and the doing itself was not there. A physical activity performed with full concentration, a moment of genuine play. A conversation so interesting that self-consciousness was irrelevant. A piece of music that took over the listening completely. In those moments, you were not observed and you were not observing. You were simply what was happening. The overhead of the observer, the monitoring, the evaluating, the comparing was absent. And the absence felt, retrospectively, like relief, like lightness, like the unexpected discovery of how heavy the observer actually was, only recognized in the moment of it lifting. The observer is lifting now. The night has made it possible, not through effort, but through depletion. The machinery needs fuel, and the fuel is running low, and in the low fuel state, the machine runs quietly, then slowly, then stops. Let it stop. The awareness does not stop with the machine. The awareness continues. Simple, clear, belonging to no one. The room, the breath, the dark. Chapter 24, Where Sorrow Ends. If your mind has drifted, let it return gently. You do not need to have caught every word. The parts that are useful will find you. This is a good part to return for. The sorrow we planted earlier, the anxiety of tomorrow, the ache that lives in the distance between what is and what was or what might be, lives in time. We have been coming back to this all night, from different angles. The sorrow that is chronic, that has become the texture of ordinary days rather than a response to a specific event, is maintained by the mind's movement between then and now, between here and there, between what is and what the mind believes should be. And the question we put down then was this: where does the ending of this sorrow actually live? Not in tomorrow, not in resolution of the problem the sorrow points toward, not in achieving the thing that is absent or recovering what has been lost. The ending of the chronic sorrow, the sorrow that has become a kind of weather rather than a specific storm, lives here. In this specific attention, at this specific moment, to what is actually present, not attention as a technique applied to the problem of sorrow. Attention as a quality of presence to what is. The warm room, the breathing body, the darkness that is not frightening, but simply the ordinary dark that has always been on the other side of the light. The sorrow is in the past and the future simultaneously, in the memory of what was lost and the projection of how long the loss will continue. The present moment is neither of these. The present moment, attended to fully, does not contain the sorrow in the form that maintains it. This is not a cure. Losses are real. Grief is real. The things that have happened and cannot be undone are real. Krishnamurti was not proposing that clear seeing erases the past or makes absence less absent. He was proposing something more modest and more available. That the quality of attention which is fully in the present moment, which is not simultaneously in the memory of what was, and the projection of what might be, is a quality in which the maintaining of chronic sorrow becomes, at least for its duration, impossible. The night is more than half done. The body has been lying in the dark long enough that the muscles have released the day's holding. The breath has been moving without instruction. The mind has been through a long passage, through the tent at Ommen, through the lens-grinding bench in The Hague, through the factory floor in Paris, through the diary entry in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it has arrived here. Here is a warm room, a body that has done its work, a darkness that is simply the absence of light, not the absence of anything else. A silence that is not empty, but full of the ordinary sounds of a house at rest, a neighborhood at rest, a world that is also lying down for a few hours before the next day begins. The sorrow of tomorrow can wait. It will still be there, if it needs to be, when tomorrow arrives. For now, there is only this: the breath and the room and the awareness that requires no maintenance, no observer, no ongoing effort to produce. In the months after his dissolution of the Order of the Star in 1929, Krishnamurti travelled and gave talks and answered letters, and continued in the new and quieter context of his post-organizational life, to look at the same questions he had always been looking at. He wrote in a notebook from that period about the strange quality of freedom that came not from achieving something, but from ceasing to be held by something, not freedom as an arrival, freedom as a release. The distinction is subtle and important. The arriving model says, once I have solved this, I will be free. The release model says, freedom is what remains when the insistence on solving stops. Tonight is a small instance of the second kind. Not because the solvable things are solved, because the insistence has run its course, for now. And what remains is the room and the breath and the dark. Chapter 25. Marcus Aurelius at the Danube. In the winter of 170 CE, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius sat in a military tent on the Danube frontier in what is now Austria or Hungary. The precise location is uncertain, and opened a small leather-bound notebook. Outside the tent, across the dark river, the Germanic tribes known as the Marcomanni had been pressing against the empire's borders for years. The campaign was exhausting and seemed without end. Rome itself was still recovering from a plague that had killed perhaps 5 million people in the previous decade. Marcus had been on campaign, away from his family and his library and the philosophical discussions he loved, for years at a stretch. He was also, by all accounts, one of the most powerful men in the world. The Roman emperor in the 2nd century CE commanded an empire that stretched from the north of England to the edges of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Everything within those borders, effectively, belonged to him or operated at his permission. He opened his notebook and wrote not commands, but questions. Not decrees, but self-examinations. The document we know as the Meditations is a private journal that Marcus apparently never intended for publication. It is a record of a man in a position of enormous external power, using the practice of Stoic philosophy to subject his own interior life to a rigorous daily examination, not to make himself feel better, but to make himself see more clearly. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." He wrote, "The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts," though this particular phrasing comes to us through a Victorian translator, and the original is somewhat different. But the underlying observation is his, and it is consistent throughout the journal. The interior life is where the real work happens. The external world is weather. The mind is a kingdom that can be governed or abandoned. Krishnamurti would have disagreed with one element of this, and the disagreement is illuminating. Marcus was proposing something active. Govern the mind, direct it toward the good, apply discipline to its tendencies. Krishnamurti was proposing something different. Understand the mind, see it clearly, and let the clarity itself be the transformation. Not governance, observation, not directing, looking. But both men are in the same territory. Both found themselves at the end of days full of enormous external demand, sitting with themselves in private and doing the work of looking at the interior with honesty and without vanity. Marcus in his military tent, Krishnamurti in his room in Ojai or Brockwood or Madras, preparing for another day of questions from strangers who needed something he could not quite give them directly. What Marcus Aurelius wrote in that military tent 2,000 years ago is still being read, in many translations, by people who find in it something they cannot quite find elsewhere. The voice of a person with every possible external reason to be distracted by the world, who consistently chose to come back to the interior instead. Who wrote, in Book 2, a line that sits quietly in the memory once you have read it. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Not peace, not happiness, strength. the specific strength of a person who knows where the actual work is being done and who does it without performance because no audience is watching and the audience does not matter. The tent outside Ommen in 1929 has long since been taken down. The military tent on the Danube is gone, but the notebooks remain, and they speak the same language, a language that says the real territory is interior, and it is available to examine right now in the quiet of whatever room you currently occupy. The room you currently occupy is dark and warm. The night has come a long way. Let the thoughts that remain, let them be simply what they are, not governed, seen. Chapter 26. Thoreau's Three Chairs. On the 4th of July 1845, a 27-year-old Harvard-educated man named Henry David Thoreau walked into the woods near Concord, Massachusetts, and moved into a small cabin he had built himself on the shore of a pond called Walden. The cabin measured 10 feet by 15 feet. It had one door, 2 windows, a brick fireplace, a loft for sleeping, and a desk at which Thoreau would write. The total cost of construction, which he recorded with the precision of a man who believed that accounts should be honest, was $28.12.5. He lived there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. Not in complete solitude, Concord was 1.5 miles away. His mother's house was within walking distance, and he received visitors regularly, but in sufficient simplicity that the ordinary business of life became, briefly, simple enough to see clearly. In the book he eventually wrote about this period, Walden, published in 1854, he described the furniture of the cabin. He had 3 chairs. One, he wrote, was for solitude. 2 were for friendship. 3 were for society. This is one of the most efficient descriptions of the social life anyone has written. 3 chairs, all the necessary positions for a human being in relation to the world in order of increasing complication. The chair for solitude is the one that concerns us tonight. Thoreau went to Walden Pond, as he described in the chapter called Where I Lived and What I Lived For, because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if he could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when he came to die, discover that he had not lived. Not because solitude was an end in itself, but because he suspected that the noise and complication of ordinary life, the business and the busyness, the obligations and the social performances had become, for him and possibly for everyone, a substitute for the actually essential things. What he found at Walden was not dramatic. He found that the essential things are quiet. A pond in the early morning, the ice crackling as it forms in November, the sound of the loon, the work of hoeing his bean field in the summer heat, the company of an occasional visitor, valued more precisely because it was occasional. The long evenings with no appointment and no obligation. The discovery that a life stripped of the inessential is not impoverished but enlarged. Krishnamurti would have approved of this, with one qualification. He would have asked, what happens when the deliberate simplicity becomes its own kind of project? When the 3-chair life becomes a thing you are doing rather than a state you are inhabiting? At what point does living deliberately become another form of the self-maintenance project, only wearing the clothes of simplicity rather than the clothes of ambition? This is a question without a comfortable answer, and Thoreau did not entirely resolve it in his own life. But the gesture, the act of stepping back from the accumulated complexity of a life and asking which of it is actually essential, is one that translates out of the 19th century and into any room, including this one. What is essential to tonight? The body, the breath, the dark, the warmth, the slow approach of sleep. Everything else, the social performances and the accumulated obligations and the version of yourself that the morning will require you to play, is already set aside. The chair for solitude is the only chair in use right now. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, Thoreau wrote in the Economy chapter of Walden. He meant it not as condemnation, but as diagnosis. He believed the desperation was quiet because it had never been looked at clearly. He believed it was in the nature of the desperation to disguise itself as normalcy, as busyness, as the ordinary texture of days. And he believed that clarity, even a brief, imperfect clarity, such as 2 years in a small cabin by a Massachusetts pond might provide, was itself a kind of liberation. Tonight offers something similar, not 2 years, a few hours, but the quality of the solitude, if you allow it, is the same. Chapter 27. Choiceless Attention. The phrase choiceless awareness, Krishnamurti used it thousands of times across 60 years, and it was consistently the phrase that people found most difficult and most necessary in equal measure. Let us come at it directly, because the night has been preparing the ground for exactly this. When the mind is in its ordinary mode, the conditioned, evaluating, constantly active mode that runs from waking until the moment sleep finally overrides it, it is never simply with what is there. It is always, simultaneously, doing something else. It is comparing this to that. It is judging whether this is good or bad, useful or useless, threatening or benign. It is reaching toward what it prefers and moving away from what it doesn't. It is approving and disapproving, selecting and discarding every moment of its operation. This is normal. This is what minds do. This is the machinery of a consciousness that has been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure toward selection, toward getting food and avoiding danger and reproducing and surviving, and then has been additionally shaped by the specific culture and family and historical moment into which each particular person was born. The choosing never stops, because the organism and its culture never stop needing choices to be made. But the choosing has a cost. It means the mind is never fully present to what is. There is always a layer of evaluation between the awareness and the experience. A filter, a commentary, a constant running assessment of whether this moment is what should be happening or whether some other moment would be better. Choiceless awareness, in Krishnamurti's usage, is the quality of attention that is not doing this. Not because the choices have been suppressed. Pushing the evaluating mind underground does not eliminate it, it just makes it invisible. But because the evaluating mind has been seen so clearly for so long that its activity is no longer mistaken for reality itself, When the evaluation is seen as evaluation rather than as fact, there is a gap. A space between the awareness and the commentary in which the awareness can simply be aware without the commentary adding its layer. This sounds very precise and also very elusive. It is both. But here is the practical approach. For this moment, in this room, notice whatever is present. Not choosing what to notice, simply allowing the awareness to be with whatever is already there, the specific quality of the darkness. The temperature of the air at the surface of the skin, the sound, if there is one, of the building settling, or the street outside, or the breath of someone nearby. The weight of the body against the mattress. These things are already there. They do not require the evaluating mind to be present. They are simply present. And in this noticing, without choosing what to notice and without judging what is noticed, there is a quality of attention that is very close to what Krishnamurti spent 60 years describing. Not achieving it, arriving at it, but already here, already in it, simply by allowing the awareness to rest in what is already true. The room is dark and warm, the body is warm, the breath moves. These are facts that require nothing from you. The philosopher and teacher Krishnamurti, standing in that field in Holland in 1929 with 3,000 people waiting to hear something particular, told them instead that truth is a pathless land. He told them that the very act of preparing to arrive somewhere, the direction of the attention toward a destination, was what prevented arrival. What he was pointing at was already the case. For them, sitting in the tent. For you, here, now. Already the case. Awareness without a center, without the choice of what to be aware of. Simply this: the dark room, the warm body, the breath that continues without being asked. There is a moment that sometimes happens in the interval between waking and sleep when the evaluating mind makes one last effort. It produces in the falling away a thought that seems important. You have not resolved this, you have not settled that, you cannot sleep yet. The unfinished business will not wait. This is the final protest of the conditioned mind, the last argument before it surrenders to the biological necessity of sleep. It arrives not because the unfinished business is genuinely urgent, but because the conditioned mind has been trained over years and decades to confuse its own activity with necessity, to believe that stopping would be irresponsible. You can hear this protest. You can acknowledge it. Yes, there are unresolved things. Yes, tomorrow exists. Yes, the accounting mind has items on its list. And none of this is required right now. The protest can be heard and acknowledged without being obeyed. Chapter 28. The Self that Watches Itself. If you have been drifting in and out, that is fine. Come back easily. This is what these late chapters are for, the slow return, again and again, to something simpler than the thinking that has been our companion all night. There is a particular moment Krishnamurti described in various talks that he called the ending of the self. He was careful with this phrase because he knew how easily it could be misread. He was not describing a mystical dissolution of personality. He was not recommending the erasure of the individual or the abandonment of ordinary functioning. He was describing something much more specific and much more available. The moment when the self-referential loop, the loop in which the mind watches itself, watching itself, watching itself, in an infinite regression of meta-commentary, simply stops. Not through effort, not through achieving a meditative state, through seeing the loop so clearly that the energy maintaining it is no longer being supplied. The self-referential loop is the inner monologue, not just the surface-level commentary, that voice that narrates the day and composes the grocery list and rehearses the conversation. That is the obvious layer. The deeper layer is the meta-commentary, the voice that watches the inner monologue and evaluates whether it is a good or bad inner monologue. That watches the watching and decides whether the watching is correct. That notices the noticing and forms an opinion about whether the noticing was the right thing to notice. This loop uses a great deal of energy, quietly, continuously, without announcement. It is the background hum of what the educated, reflective, self-aware, modern person calls consciousness. It feels like intelligence. It feels like care. It feels like the responsible activity of a person who takes their inner life seriously. It is also exhausting in the way that only a very quiet, very persistent activity can be. The exhaustion that is not dramatic but cumulative. The kind that is responsible in part for the second kind of tiredness we discussed at the beginning of the night. When this loop pauses, when the self temporarily stops watching itself, what remains is simply the awareness, not a self that is aware. Awareness. The room is aware. The darkness is aware. The breath is aware. These are not mystical claims. They are attempts to describe in language something that language is poorly suited to describe, the quality of experience when the self-monitoring apparatus briefly releases. You are near this. The night has been long enough and the thinking has been thorough enough that the energy available for self-monitoring is naturally diminishing. This is how sleep arrives. Not through effort, but through the depletion of what was keeping the system active. And in the interval between the depleted wakefulness and the beginning of sleep, there is sometimes this: a moment of simple, effortless awareness that does not belong to anyone in particular. Rest in that direction, not straining toward it, simply allowing the natural depletion to proceed, and noticing as it proceeds the quality of what remains when the monitoring quiets. The body that is warm and horizontal in this dark room is doing its work without your management. The heart beats, the blood moves. The lungs expand and contract with a faithfulness that has never failed since the moment of your birth. These systems do not require the self-monitoring loop to continue operating. They will be running long after you have fallen asleep, and they will be running when you wake. The self that watches itself is not what keeps you alive. What keeps you alive is much older and much more reliable than that. Let the self-watching rest. The organism knows what it is doing. The night knows how to end. The Japanese concept of mushin, sometimes translated as no mind or mind without mind, describes a related quality in the context of martial practice. The trained practitioner in a state of mushin acts without the self-monitoring that the untrained person brings to every action, without the inner commentary on how the action is going, without the evaluation of whether it is correct, without the comparison to how it has been done before. The action simply happens from a deep and practiced preparedness, without the overlay of self-consciousness. Krishnamurti was not recommending martial practice. He was not recommending any practice. But the state that Mushin points toward, the acting without the actor's self-awareness cluttering the action, is in the territory he consistently pointed at. The quality of doing that is not simultaneously watching itself do, the awareness that does not observe itself being aware. Chapter 29, What Sleep Actually Is. Krishnamurti was asked in one of his talks in Madras in the 1970s, what happens during sleep? He answered carefully. He said that during deep sleep, the kind without dreams, the continuous activity of the self, the narrative, the maintenance, the comparison and judgment and planning temporarily ceases. The self goes offline in the way that a machine goes offline when its operator stops running it. What remains during that offline period is the organism, functioning without the overlay of personality, doing the work of repair and consolidation and renewal that the body needs the absence of waking consciousness to perform. He said that this was why sleep felt like a relief, why the state of wakefulness, even when the day has been pleasant, is something the body is ready to release by evening, not because the day was bad, because wakefulness, by definition, involves the self's continuous operation, and the self's continuous operation is work. And then he said something that the audience found unexpected. He said that in deep sleep, there was something very like what he had been pointing at throughout his teaching. Something very like the awareness without a center, the consciousness without the overlay of the self. The deep sleep state was not, he was careful to say, a state of enlightenment or liberation. It was simply the state in which the self's overlay was temporarily removed by biological necessity. But the quality of it, the quiet, the absence of the self-referential loop, the simple being of the organism without the commentary, was in the same territory. Which meant, he suggested, that the thing he had been trying to describe for 60 years, the quality of consciousness that does not require the self to be running, was not foreign to any person in his audience. They visited it every night. They had been visiting it since infancy. The deep sleep state is available to every human organism. The waking access to something like it, the choiceless awareness, the attention without a center, was simply the same quality, made available at a different time through a different means. Not mystical, in other words, biological, already known, already visited. The unfamiliar thing is not the state itself, but the waking access to it. This is close. The body in the bed, moving through the hours of this night, is approaching the boundary between waking and sleep. The thinking mind is exhausting itself, slowly, naturally, in the way that thinking minds do when they are not given fresh material to process and not being artificially stimulated. The worries have been examined. The plans have been turned over. The past has been revisited, and the future has been projected. And the mind has been through a long journey through philosophy and psychology and the particular kind of looking that Krishnamurti devoted his life to. The journey is nearly complete. What is at the end of the journey is not an arrival anywhere new. It is the recognition of something that has always been there. The deep, reliable rest that the organism moves into each night when the self finally puts down its work. It is the body's deep knowledge of how to release. It is the night doing what nights have always done. The breath lengthening now, the body heavier, the thinking slower, the darkness, simply the darkness, not threatening, not waiting for anything, just the ordinary darkness that has always been on the other side of the light, patient and complete. The sleep researcher Matthew Walker, writing in the 21st century, described what happens in the brain during different stages of sleep. The slow-wave sleep that repairs the body, the REM sleep that processes emotional memory, the rapid cycling between stages that characterizes a healthy night's rest. The body in sleep is doing work that is not available to it during wakefulness, consolidating what was learned, clearing metabolic waste from the brain, regulating hormones, processing the emotional residue of the day in a format that reduces its intensity. This is not philosophy. This is biology. And the biology says the body needs this. The body has been building toward this for hours. The work of the day and the work of tonight's looking has prepared the ground for the work that only sleep can do. Chapter 30. The End of the Argument. If you are still awake, this is a good place to come back to. The night is late enough now that waking is the exception. What remains of the mind's activity is quieter, slower, less insistent. The argument is ending. By argument, I mean the ongoing negotiation between the mind and its circumstances. The negotiation about whether things are acceptable as they are, or whether something needs to change before rest is permitted. The argument that says, I cannot rest because this is unresolved, or I cannot rest because tomorrow is uncertain, or I cannot rest because the day did not go as it should have, and someone should acknowledge this. These arguments are real. The conditions they point to are real. The unresolved things are genuinely unresolved, and tomorrow is genuinely uncertain, and the day may genuinely not have gone as it should. Krishnamurti was not suggesting otherwise. He was not recommending a philosophy of pretending that difficulty does not exist. He was recommending something more honest and more demanding than pretending. He was recommending looking at the argument itself, not its content, not the specific grievance or the specific fear, the structure of it. The fact that the mind is refusing permission to rest until certain conditions are met, and that those conditions, because they involve other people and the future and the uncontrollable world, may not be available to be met tonight, and that the refusal to rest until the conditions are met is not protecting anything. It is simply the machine running without a useful task because the machine has not yet been told that it is permitted to stop. The machine is permitted to stop. Not permanently, it will start again in the morning and it will still have the same material to work with. But for these hours, in this room, in this warmth, the argument can be set aside without anything being lost. The unresolved things will be exactly as unresolved in the morning as they are right now. The sleep that passes between now and morning will not make them worse. The rest that the body needs, and has needed for several hours, will give you more capacity to deal with them than the continued running of the machine through the night. Carl Rogers, the psychologist who founded person-centered therapy and published his major work On Becoming a Person in 1961, described what he called unconditional positive regard as the most powerful thing one person can offer another. Not approval of everything the person does, not agreement with everything they think, but a quality of acceptance that is not conditional on the person being a particular way, a presence that says you are acceptable as you are right now without needing to be otherwise. Tonight, extend that quality to yourself, not as a technique, as a recognition. The person lying in this room at this hour, in this particular state of not quite sleep, is acceptable as they are. The unresolved things do not make this person unacceptable. The uncertainty of tomorrow does not make this person insufficient. The argument with the day's events does not need to be won before rest is available. The argument is ending, not because it has been resolved, because the night has been long enough that the energy for arguing has reached its natural limit. Let the jaw go, let the hands go, let the eyes behind the closed lids release the small effort they have been making since sometime this afternoon to focus, to direct, to see. The darkness requires no focus. The darkness is already here, complete. In the winter of 1880, in a large house in the Russian countryside, Leo Tolstoy, then at the height of his fame, with War and Peace and Anna Karenina both behind him, the estate running well, the family intact, the world's regard certain, removed a rope from his study. He removed it because he did not trust himself not to use it. He was considering ending his life, and he could not understand why. He had everything. He wrote about this in a document he called A Confession, published in 1882, and what he wrote is this: I could not understand what would come of what I was doing. I could not ascribe any reasonable meaning to a single act or to my whole life. The despair was not about practical failure. It was about the absence of meaning underneath all the practical success. And the answer he eventually arrived at was not philosophical, but simple. He stopped being in argument with the life he had and started living it. Chapter 31, Spinoza at the Bench. In the last decade of his life, Baruch Spinoza worked every morning at the lens bench in his rented room in The Hague. He was not a young man anymore. He died at 44 of lung disease, almost certainly made worse by years of breathing the fine glass dust that lens grinding produces. But every morning he sat at the bench and ground the glass. The precision of the work required a particular quality of attention, not a forced, effortful concentration, but the natural focusing of a mind fully occupied with a task that demanded everything from it. The glass had to be even, the curvature had to be exact. A lens ground slightly wrong would distort rather than clarify the image it was meant to serve. He is remembered now as one of the most radical philosophers of the 17th century. His idea that God and nature are the same infinite substance, that there is no transcendent creator standing outside the universe, but only the universe itself, in its infinite self-expression, was considered so dangerous that the Ethics was published only after his death. He knew during his lifetime that the book would not survive publication, and he kept it in a drawer and showed it only to a small circle of trusted readers. But the lens grinding was public. The neighbors could see the light in his window in the morning. They could hear the faint sound of the grinding. They saw a quiet, slim, dark-eyed man working carefully with glass and light. Some of them knew he was a philosopher. Most of them did not know that the philosopher at the bench was writing in his spare hours one of the most consequential books in the history of Western thought. There is something in that image, the philosopher at the bench, the book in the drawer, the glass dust in the lamplight, that speaks to a kind of integrity that does not require an audience. The work that is done because it is the right work, not because it will be rewarded or recognized. The thinking that happens because it is the right kind of thinking, not because it will make its thinker famous. Spinoza had been cast out of his community, his name formally cursed, his books banned during his lifetime. He ground lenses, he wrote the Ethics. He did not perform either activity for anyone. He simply did both in the same small room for the remaining 21 years of his life. Krishnamurti, by contrast, was very public. He talked in front of thousands of people for 60 years. He was well known. He received visitors. He was recorded, filmed, transcribed. But there was something in his quality that was recognizable to anyone who had spent time with Spinoza's work. The same absence of performance. The same doing of the work because the work was the work, not because it would produce a particular outcome for the person doing it. Spinoza wrote in the Ethics that an emotion ceases to be suffering the moment we form a clear and distinct picture of it. He was not saying the emotion disappears when understood. He was saying that the element of suffering in the emotion, the element that overwhelms and distorts and persists beyond what the situation actually requires, is reduced in direct proportion to how clearly it is seen. The understanding does not eliminate the feeling. It removes the additional suffering that is produced by the feeling being opaque to the one feeling it. This is what we have been doing all night. Not eliminating anything, seeing it more clearly. The anxiety of tomorrow, the weight of yesterday, the second kind of tiredness, the fear that is maintained by thought, the sorrow that lives in time, none of these have been eliminated. All of them have been looked at carefully in the particular kind of light that clear attention provides. And something about them is, at this hour, less opaque than it was at the beginning of the night. The bench is cleared. The glass dust has settled. The lamp in Spinoza's window has been dark for 350 years, and the room in The Hague has long since been demolished and rebuilt and demolished again. But the principle that operated at the bench, clarity as its own form of relief, is still operating quietly in this room tonight. Chapter 32. What the dark holds. The darkness of the room at this hour is not the same darkness it was 3 hours ago. 3 hours ago, the darkness was full. full of the day's momentum, the evening's unreleased energy, the mind's insistence on going over things it had already been over and planning for things it could not yet act on. The darkness was the container for all of that. The night as a kind of pressure, the not sleeping as a kind of failure. This darkness is different, quieter. Not because anything has been resolved. The things that were unresolved at the beginning of the night are still in roughly the same state. But because the night has been long enough, and the looking has been thorough enough, that the relationship to the unresolving has shifted slightly. The unresolving is less demanding at this hour than it was when the night began. Krishnamurti said something in a talk in Sarnan in the early 1970s that is useful here. He said that the mind in crisis, the mind in genuine difficulty, facing something genuinely hard, often needs, more than anything else, to not be alone with itself. Not in the sense of needing another person present, necessarily, but in the sense of needing the problem to be seen by something more spacious than the problem itself. Needing, as he put it, a mind that is not afraid of the problem to be with the problem. That quality, the mind that is not afraid of the problem, is what clarity provides. Not the absence of the problem, not the solution to the problem, but a quality of presence that is spacious enough to hold the problem without being overwhelmed by it. This is what the night has been building toward. Not a solution, a spaciousness. The particular quality of attention that Krishnamurti spent 60 years pointing at, patient, clear, undistorted by the urgency that fear adds to everything, does not resolve problems. But it changes the relationship to them. And the change in relationship is itself a form of relief. The dark at this hour is simply the dark. The ordinary darkness that falls when the sun goes below the horizon and the lights are off. Not threatening, not full of consequence. Just the ordinary condition of the night, which has been the ordinary condition of every night since the beginning of nights. You have been in this darkness before, many times, and you have come through it every time. The morning has always come. The day has always resumed. Whatever was unresolved at midnight has always been there in the morning, unchanged, and has been dealt with in the morning with the resources that the sleep provided. The dark holds nothing you have not already survived. Let the body be heavy now. Let it be as heavy as it actually is after the full weight of a day. Not holding itself up, not arranging itself for any particular purpose. Simply heavy, warm, horizontal, and present in this room. That is simply a room. In this night, that is simply a night. In this life. That is simply a life complicated and real and not currently requiring anything from you. The breath is slower. Notice how much slower. The body is doing this on its own. The body has been doing this on its own for a while and will continue doing it until sleep takes over, which is very close now, very close. Chapter 33, The Quieting. The sentences are shorter now. The night has earned that. The long, careful sentences of the earlier hours, the ones that built their arguments slowly and placed their thinkers precisely, and traced the machinery of the conditioned mind with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Those sentences belong to the part of the night that is finished. What remains calls for something simpler. A man in Holland in 1929. A tent and a field and 3,000 people, and one person standing up and setting everything down. The river Vecht continuing. This is what the quieting looks like. Not the forced quiet of someone trying to be still. The natural quiet that arrives when the activity that was producing noise has simply finished. When the engine has run its course. When the day is genuinely, completely, finally over. Krishnamurti described in his later years something he called the sacred. He was careful with the word. He did not mean religious. He did not mean supernatural. He meant something more precise, the quality of a mind that has become genuinely quiet, not through suppression, but through the complete cessation of the self-maintaining activity. A mind that is no longer generating itself. A mind in which the observer has stopped observing, and what remains is simply the awareness. He said this quality, this genuinely quiet mind, was sacred in the same way that a clear mountain pool is sacred, not because anything holy has been applied to it, because the clarity itself, the absolute undistorted quality of it, is extraordinary. The pool reflects exactly what is there. Nothing more, nothing less, no distortion, no added meaning. Just the sky reflected perfectly. The breath in the body right now is moving toward that. Not straining, simply moving. The body's own intelligence doing what it has done 10,000 times before, leading the way into the deep rest it needs. The thinking mind, which has been so busy and so thorough and so earnest tonight, is releasing its grip. Not all at once. Gradually, the way hands release something held for a long time, a little at first, then more, then fully. The room is quiet, the breath is slow. The darkness outside the window is the same darkness it has always been. And inside, in the body, in the mind that is becoming less and less insistent, something is settling. Not arriving anywhere, simply settling, like dust in a room where the wind has finally stopped. You are very close. The voice of this night will be here when you return to it. The night itself will continue whether you hear it or not. What is most useful now is not the listening, but the releasing. The small, unhurried release of whatever the hands are still holding, whatever the mind is still gripping, whatever the body is still bracing against from long and faithful habit. Let that go, not with effort, simply let it. Chapter 34, Each Breath, a Return. Each breath is a small return. Not a return to anything in particular, a return to the body, to the warmth and the weight and the reality of being here in this room at this hour with the night doing what nights do around you. Krishnamurti in Madras. In 1985, the year before he died. An old man in a chair, still talking, still asking the same questions he had been asking for 60 years with the same patience, the same clarity, the same complete absence of performance. Someone in the audience asked him, after all of this, after all these years, what is left? He sat for a moment, and then he said, in effect, "There is the beauty of a tree in the morning light. There is the sound of water. There is attention itself, the bare fact of awareness, present and alive and asking nothing. There is love, not as something the self possesses, but as the quality that arises when the self is not insisting on itself." These are very simple things to say after 60 years of intricate and demanding philosophical investigation. But that is the point. The investigation leads not to something more complex, but to something more simple. Back to the beginning. The morning light, the water, the bare fact of awareness. Each breath is that simple, in and out. The chest rises and falls. The body continues its ancient work without being asked. This has been true since the moment of your birth. It will be true until the moment of your death. In between, in the span of years between those two moments, everything complicated happened. All the conditioning and the fear and the sorrow and the love and the achievement and the failure and the relationship and the loss, all of it happened in the space that the breath makes between each one. The breath does not know about any of it. The breath simply moves, in and out, in the morning light on a street in Madras, in the lamplight of a small room in The Hague, in a tent, in a field, in Holland, in August, in a year that now feels very old and very far away. In and out, in this room, in this darkness, in this body that is warm and still and ready, each breath is a small return. Return to the warmth, return to the room, return to the simple fact of being here, which requires no justification, no achievement, no correct understanding of anything. Simply here, breathing in the dark. Chapter 35. Nothing more is needed tonight. There is a quiet that has been building all night. Not the quiet of absence, not the quiet of a room from which all the furniture has been removed and all the people have gone and all the sound has been extinguished. The quiet of completion. The quiet of something that has moved through its whole arc and arrived at its natural end. The thinkers who have been present tonight, Krishnamurti in his tent, Spinoza at his bench, Simone Weil on the factory floor, William James at his writing table in Cambridge, Marcus Aurelius in the military night, Thoreau at Walden Pond, all of them arrived eventually at something like this. At the recognition that the searching has a natural end. Not in finding the thing being searched for, necessarily, but in the searching itself, exhausting its urgency. The urgency that said, I must understand this before I can rest. I must resolve this before I can sleep. I must arrive somewhere before this is finished. That urgency is finished. Not because you have arrived anywhere, because the night has been long enough and the looking has been honest enough that the urgency has simply used up its fuel. And what remains when the urgency stops? What has always been there underneath the urgency, quieter and more patient and not requiring anything, is this warmth, this breath, this dark room that is simply a dark room at the end of a real day. Nothing more is needed tonight. Not understanding, not resolution, not a particular state of mind. The mind is in whatever state it is in, and the state is fine. The body is in whatever state it is in, and the state is fine. The things that are unresolved, and they will be dealt with in the daylight with the resources that this sleep will provide. Krishnamurti, in that field in Holland, put down the role and kept the looking. He kept looking for 60 years. And at the end of 60 years, what he saw was not different from what was there at the beginning. The morning light, the sound of water, the breath of awareness, simple and alive and not requiring anything to be otherwise. Nothing more is needed. The body knows, the breath knows, the darkness knows. Sleep is very close now, very close. Let it come. Chapter 36. The Pathless Land. The river Vecht is still moving. Somewhere in Holland, in the dark, in a field where a tent stood for a few days in August 97 years ago, the river is making its slow curve and continuing. 3,000 people sat in that tent and heard a man say that truth is a pathless land. Most of them did not know what to do with that. Some of them were angry. Some of them were relieved. Most of them eventually went home, put their things in order, made their ordinary lives, carried the question with them as people carry questions, in the back of the mind, returning to it on certain evenings or in certain silences, the question unchanged, the person carrying it slowly changing. You carry a question too. Not necessarily the same one, but something unresolved, something that has been circling for longer than you can remember, something that returns on evenings like this when the day is finished and the dark is full and the mind, briefly, is no longer performing. The pathless land is not somewhere you have not been. It is not a destination requiring preparation or achievement or the correct understanding of the correct philosophy. It is where you are, right now, when the path-making mind releases its grip, when the self that is always moving towards something stops briefly, not because it has arrived, but because it has simply stopped. And in the stopping, what is there is what has always been there. The warmth of the body, the slow breath, the darkness that is not threatening, but simply the ordinary dark that fills the space when the light goes out. The awareness that is present without being produced by anyone. The simple, remarkable, utterly ordinary fact of being alive tonight in this room. Krishnamurti talked for 60 years and kept returning to this. Not to a conclusion, to the beginning, always to the beginning. The morning light and the sound of water, and the quality of attention that is not afraid of what it sees. The tent at Ommen was taken down, the canvas packed away, the chairs returned, 3,000 people walked back into their lives. The river continued. You have walked back to yours, and your life at this hour is very simple. A warm body in a dark room, a breath that moves without being asked, a night that is doing what nights do, holding you in its quiet, absolute dark, while the body does its ancient work of repair and renewal, and the mind finally lets go. The pathless land is here. Sleep now.